I've been radicalized for quite a while, but I don't think anything could have really prepared me for how correct worst worst case scenario thinking couldn't have ever really mentally prepared me for the amount of people that don't understand that right now, like that don't understand right now we are in 1930, probably 8 Germany, where the majority of the people in the country are starting to understand or sign on with one side or the other. And what we're coming to see is that most of our government has signed on with not the side of the common man, whether that's state or federal. Local remains to be seen. That's very much a localized question that each person I feel needs to answer. But my point in this is that if you haven't been radicalized within the last 5 years, I don't think it's going to happen for you because you are entirely too beholden or supportive of the system. These are just a few examples, but the death of empathy in this country is a major contributing factor, and there are plenty of quotes from earlier in the 2010s where you could tell that the right was trying to demonize the concept of empathy. Essentially, they were trying to make it so that empathy was seen as a weakness amongst the people of this country, and they directed that most specifically at the men. This is where the term the red pill movement comes from. It's because you have all of these disaffected men who are actively being manipulated by their government to think that they need to rely harder on the patriarchy because that's how things were able to be better controlled and more likely to result in success of a family unit in the 50s and 60s. What they don't tell you about that is that in the 50s and 60s, they were taxing the corporations and the richest, essentially, the top earners, at 91%. So all of that surplus capital that labor is producing, aka all of the wages that you're not getting paid because your salary isn't as high as it should have been even back then, at the very least, all of those profits were getting taxed and put into public services. That's why you had robust post offices. That's why you had public parks that you didn't have to pay to get into. And you know why all of those things started to go away? Because the US government, among many other things like the CIA, realized that those public services would be accessible to all people the more that those not white people were able to get rights in this country. That's why you have a time frame where you can watch a circumstance like the bottom left panel pan out 120 times in the last decade, and the rationale behind it still not being apparent. It's not like you can sit here and say that it's a race bait issue when this exact circumstance has played out too many times for this to be an isolated event. The list of names is entirely too long. And here's where the lack of empathy thing wraps back around. Because, see, all of these other circumstances could be anyone. They aren't necessarily specific to one minority group based off of their consistent demonization through media portrayals, among many other things. The part I'm trying to get to is that radicalization and empathy are interlinked, because in almost every one of these circumstances, most common people would look at this and go, that's wrong. And even the one in the bottom right, they would look at it and go, that doesn't make sense, at the very least. The fact that people are no longer questioning things like this happening this often is what happens when you have a slow drag into fascism. You're stripping away things one at a time, and by the time people get organized enough to actually do something about it, all of the access to the resources necessary to revolt have been taken away. So, if you are somebody who has already become radicalized enough to understand that empathy should be the leading characteristic of any nation state, specifically, at the very least, for the people that live in the country, let alone how they run their foreign policy should also be an extension of that empathy, you then realized how easy it was to remove the empathy from this country and watch everybody essentially consume themselves or consume others. Because when you remove the empathy from a system that's so hyper competitive, you're going to get situations where you just X people out of the equation, like the top left, and you don't feel anything about it. You don't care that this person has other people depending on them, despite the fact that you yourself have other people depending on you. And in most situations, it's because you have other people depending on you that you make a heartless ass decision like this. So the necessity of empathy is utmost because it prevents you from making circumstances like this possible in the first place from a policy standpoint. On an individual level, radicalization has been demonized because it's been often associated with terrorism, despite the fact that when you're being radical according to actual ethical practices, you can start to spot the differences between people that want to be radical just for the sole fact of destroying shit versus people that want to be radical because they see that the system as it stands is not beneficial in the ways that it pledges to be, and as such, we, the people of this country, have a responsibility, not a right, a responsibility to unseat that government. If you guys are going to lean on these documents so hard and cherry pick lines, I'm absolutely going to cherry pick lines from the same documents that you all are trying to use against us. So, if you're going to talk about things like the Declaration of Independence and celebrating America's 250th fucking birthday, then how about this? How about you level the playing field and stop being a chicken shit building a bunker while you try to provoke nuclear war? How about you actually start, I don't know, getting rid of the people that are hindrances to genuinely progressing this country as a whole? Because if you have not been radicalized by the genuine or constant, if we're going to be honest, the constant failures of the rule of law within the last 2 years, considering at the baseline, our current president is a 34-time convicted felon of fraud and a convicted, a sex offender of various reputes, given the fact of how long-standing his relationship with you-know-who was. We're not even going to get into that. So, empathy and radicalism are always going to be interlinked when your radicalism is coming from a place of equity. And so, if you have empathy, the desire for equity is going to be inherent because all people should be able to live or should have access to whatever means necessary to allow them to live a dignified life. You can't bullshit when FDR wrote it into the goddamn legislation that the minimum wage was still supposed to be able to provide a decent quality of life to the people who lived off of that fucking salary. That was the entire point of the minimum wage. You motherfuckers just don't read anything. That's really what it boils down to. And of course you don't read anything because they're trying to make sure that the information that you get is however they've spoon-fed spun it so that you can live in your pre-existing bubble of confirmation bias. So for those of you who have popped that bubble and actually want to see the world or already do see the world for the way it is, I challenge you to start speaking out the way I have, because it's not like I'm the only one who can see this shit. And it's not like I'm the only one who is dedicated and angry enough to do something about it.